January 1945, over central Honshu, Japan. The night sky above Japan appears calm. Below, cities rest under winter darkness. Above them, far beyond the reach of searchlights, engines hum where no Japanese pilot expects them to be. At nearly 30,000 feet, silver shapes move in steady formation. They are not visible from the ground. They are barely audible, and they are flying higher than Japan's air defense doctrine was ever designed to fight. Radar operators track faint returns that don't behave like anything seen before. Interceptor squadrons scramble anyway. Fighters climb hard, engines straining, oxygen thinning. But the targets remain above them, calm, level, unreachable. Then the bombs begin to fall. Not from low altitude, not from dive or approach, but straight down from a height Japanese commanders believed was safe from attack. Reports move up the chain of command through the night. Anti-aircraft shells burst far below their marks. Pilots return frustrated, empty-handed, some shaken by what they could not reach. For the first time, Japan is not just under attack. That IT is being struck from a realm it cannot contest. And behind that altitude lies a story of American engineering, doctrine, and strategic patience, one that now unfolds over Japan itself. By the beginning of 1944, Japan's war was already stretching beyond its original design. The Pacific conflict had begun as a rapid campaign of expansion, short strikes, decisive naval battles, and a belief that distance itself would protect the home islands. Japanese planners had never expected sustained aerial assault on their cities, much less bombing campaigns conducted directly from the sky above Japan. Japanese air defense doctrine reflected this assumption. Before the war, Japan had invested heavily in fighters optimized for maneuverability and range, not altitude or heavy interception. Aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa and the Mitsubishi A6M0 were agile and deadly at medium altitudes, but they lacked armor, turbo superchargers, and high-altitude performance. They were designed to win air superiority over battlefields and fleets, not to climb into thin air above 25,000 feet to challenge heavily armed bombers. This design philosophy had worked early in the war in China, Southeast Asia, and the early Pacific. Japanese pilots dominated skies against poorly prepared opponents. Bombers were intercepted before reaching targets. Fighters dictated engagements. Altitude was rarely a limiting factor. But by 1943, the air war was changing. American bombers were flying higher. They were flying farther. And they were appearing in places Japanese planners once considered unreachable. The first warning signs came from Europe. Japanese military observers closely followed the air war over Germany. They read reports of American B-17s and B-24s operating at high altitude, absorbing punishment, and continuing to bomb through intense resistance. Yet these lessons were viewed through distance and difference. Europe, Japanese planners believed, was not the Pacific. Japan's geography, they argued, provided natural protection. Vast oceans, limited forward bases, and long supply lines would prevent any similar bombing campaign against the home islands. This belief shaped Japan's strategic confidence. By late 1943, however, the American island-hopping campaign began collapsing those assumptions. The capture of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands placed U.S. forces closer to Japan than ever before. Each advance shortened distances. Each new airfield extended American reach. Japanese commanders understood the danger, but they still believed altitude would protect them. If not completely, then enough. Their air defenses reflected this mindset. Japan relied on a layered system of ground observers, early radar installations of limited range, anti-aircraft artillery, and interceptor squadrons stationed around key industrial centers. But most of the system assumed bombers flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could reach. Radar coverage was uneven. Coordination between Army and Navy air units was fragmented. Anti-aircraft guns lacked advanced fire control systems comparable to those used by the Americans. Worst of all, Japan lacked a true answer to sustain high-altitude bombing. Developing such an answer required time, fuel, aluminum, engines, and trained pilots, resources Japan no longer had in abundance. By 1944, fuel shortages limited pilot training hours. Replacement pilots arrived at units with minimal experience. Engines designed for high altitude remained unreliable or underdeveloped. turbo superchargers, essential for high-altitude performance, were scarce and difficult to manufacture under bombing pressure. Even as new interceptors like the Ki-44 Shoki and Ki-61 Hien entered service, they struggled. Some could reach higher altitudes, but often too slowly. Others suffered engine failures or lacked adequate armament to down heavy bombers efficiently. Japanese pilots found themselves climbing desperately, only to arrive exhausted, underarmed, and outnumbered. Yet despite these warning signs, Japanese commanders still believed one thing remained true. America could not bomb Japan regularly, precisely, and in force. Not from such heights, not across such distances, not without unacceptable losses. That belief would not survive the arrival of a bomber unlike anything Japan had ever faced. A bomber built not just to reach Japan, but to fly above it, and that machine was already on its way. The aircraft that would challenge Japan's assumptions did not emerge quickly, cheaply, or easy. IT was the most ambitious bomber project the United States had ever attempted. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was conceived before the United States even entered the war. In 1939, American planners were already thinking beyond existing limits, beyond range, beyond payload, beyond altitude. The requirement was unprecedented. A bomber capable of carrying heavy bomb loads over intercontinental distances, cruising above most enemy defenses, and sustaining long missions with reduced crew fatigue. To achieve that, the B-29 had to be something entirely new. It featured pressurized crew compartments, allowing sustained flight at altitudes above 30,000 feet. It carried remotely operated gun turrets, directed by analog fire control computers, reducing drag while increasing defensive firepower. Most critically, it relied on powerful Wright-R 3350 engines that promised unmatched performance but arrived plagued with overheating and reliability issues. The development nearly collapsed under its own weight. Entire factories were redesigned to build the aircraft. New airfields were constructed just to accommodate its size. Thousands of engineers were pulled into solving problems that had never existed before. Early test flights ended in fires, crashes, and groundings. Crews trained on aircraft that were still being modified mid-production. Yet the urgency never faded. American leadership understood that Japan could not be defeated by naval blockade alone. Distance protected the home islands. Invasion would be catastrophic. Air power offered a third path, one that relied on reach, altitude, and sustained pressure rather than sudden shock. That vision led to Operation Matterhorn. In 1944, before American forces had secured bases close enough to Japan, B-29s were deployed to airfields in China, flying missions over the Himalayas to strike targets in Japan. These early raids proved the concept, but also revealed the limits. Logistics were brutal. Every gallon of fuel, and every bomb had to be flown in over mountains. Maintenance suffered. Sortie rates remained low. Still, the message reached Japan. American bombers had touched the home islands. The true transformation came later that year with the capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands placed Japan within direct, sustainable bombing range. Vast airfields were built at astonishing speed. Concrete runways stretched for miles. Fuel depots filled. Bomb dumps grew daily. By late 1944, the XXI Bomber Command was in position. From the Marianas, B-29s no longer needed fragile supply chains through China. They could launch directly, repeatedly, and in strength. Missions could be planned with precision. Crews could train consistently. Aircraft could be repaired and modified based on combat experience. Japanese intelligence noticed the buildup, but misunderstood its implications. They expected low or medium altitude raids, similar to earlier bombers. They believed interception would be difficult, but manageable. They believed attrition would slow the Americans. And above all, they believed altitude would still limit effectiveness. American planners initially agreed, at least in part. Early B-29 doctrine emphasized high-altitude daylight precision bombing, mirroring lessons learned in Europe. The belief was that altitude offered safety, accuracy, and reduced losses. Crews trained to bomb from heights Japanese fighters could barely reach. Bombing tables were calculated. Formation flying was refined. When the first sustained high-altitude raids began, Japanese commanders realized something fundamental had changed. Bombers were no longer skimming defenses. They were flying above them. Interceptors climbed and failed anti-aircraft fire burst far below. Radar tracked targets it could not guide weapons toward effectively. Altitude, once a buffer, had become a weapon. Yet the full consequences of that realization had not fully set in. Japanese commanders still believed adjustments could be made. New tactics tried. New orders issued. Pilots pushed harder. Engines pushed beyond limits. But the gap was widening. And as B-29 formations continued to appear, steady, unreachable, methodical, the war entered a phase Japan had never prepared to fight. That moment of confrontation between expectation and reality was about to define everything that followed. At its core, the shock Japan experienced was not emotional, that it was technical. The B-29 did not defeat Japanese defenses through numbers alone. It did so by operating in an altitude band that rendered existing systems ineffective. At cruising altitudes between 28,000 and 32,000 feet, the Superfortress flew above the optimal performance range of most Japanese interceptors. Climbing to those heights required sustained engine power, reliable oxygen systems, and pilots trained to fight in thin air, all areas where Japan struggled by 1944. For American crews, altitude was both shield and burden. Inside the pressurized compartments of the B-29, temperatures dropped far below freezing outside the hull. Oxygen systems hummed constantly. Crews wore heavy clothing, moved deliberately, and relied on engineering rather than agility for survival. This was not the close, turning air combat of earlier years. It was endurance flying, hours at altitude, maintaining formation, trusting machines to hold together. The aircraft itself was built for this environment. Remote control gun turrets reduced drag and allowed defensive fire without exposing gunners to the elements. Central fire control systems coordinated multiple turrets against single targets. At high altitude, these systems became especially effective as attacking fighters struggled to close distance and aim accurately. From a tactical standpoint, high-altitude bombing simplified American planning. Bombers could approach targets in daylight with reduced risk of interception. Formation integrity mattered more than evasive maneuvering. Crews focused on navigation, timing, and bomb release rather than constant defensive action. Losses still occurred, but they were far lower than Japanese commanders had anticipated on the ground in Japan. However, the effect felt different. Anti-aircraft batteries fired shells that burst below bomber formations. Fire control data lagged behind fast-moving targets. Gunners watched explosions dissipate harmlessly in empty air. Reports described frustration and helplessness. Defenses were firing, but not reaching. For Japanese pilots, the experience was worse. Scrambled interceptors climbed hard, engines overheating, fuel draining rapidly. Some pilots blacked out before reaching altitude. Others arrived only to find bombers still above them. Those who managed fire in positions often had mere seconds before stalling or losing control in thin air. Even successful attacks required extraordinary effort for minimal results. The human contrast between the two sides was stark. American crews fought the environment. Japanese crews fought physics. This imbalance extended beyond the cockpit. Behind every B-29 mission stood an industrial system capable of replacing aircraft, engines, and crews. Losses, while painful, did not halt operations. Aircraft rotated through maintenance. Crews rotated through rest cycles. Training pipelines continued uninterrupted. Japan had no such cushion. Each lost interceptor mattered. Each experienced pilot was irreplaceable. As weeks passed, Japanese commanders began to see altitude not as a single problem, but as a multiplier. It amplified every weakness already present. Fuel shortages, training gaps, mechanical limits, and fractured command structures. And while altitude defined the technical problem, it also set the stage for something deeper. Because once Japanese leadership understood they could not reliably reach the bombers, they were forced to confront a far more unsettling reality. The enemy was no longer just attacking Japan. He was operating above its ability to respond. For Japanese commanders, the arrival of sustained high-altitude B-29 raids triggered a crisis not of courage, but of comprehension. The problem was not simply that American bombers were difficult to shoot down. It was that they violated the core assumptions upon which Japan's air defense strategy had been built. Japanese military planning had always emphasized interception through skill, bravery, and maneuver. Fighter doctrine valued the pilot above the machine. Victory was expected to come from aggressive attack, tight formations, and the moral strength of airmen willing to press assaults at any cost. Against earlier bombers, this philosophy had proven effective. Against the B-29, it unraveled. After-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a pattern. Interceptor units reported reaching maximum climb without contact. Anti-aircraft units recorded firing hundreds of rounds with no confirmed kills. Radar stations tracked bombers they could not vector fighters toward in time. Command posts received fragmented information, often too late to coordinate meaningful response. The Japanese command structure struggled to adapt. Army and Navy air defense units operated under separate chains of command, with limited information sharing. Radar coverage was incomplete and unevenly distributed. Fire control systems lacked the precision needed to engage targets at extreme altitude. Attempts to concentrate defenses around key cities only revealed how thinly spread resources had become. Inside headquarters, frustration mounted. Commanders demanded results from units that lacked the tools to deliver them. Pilots were ordered to climb beyond safe limits. Engines were pushed past design tolerances. Losses from mechanical failure began to rival combat casualties. Morale eroded, not from fear of death, but from repeated failure against an enemy that seemed immune to effort. Psychologically, the effect was profound. Japanese pilots returned describing bombers that flew straight and level, unperturbed by interception attempts. Ground crews listened as pilots spoke of firing passes that never closed, of bombers that remained just out of reach. Anti-aircraft officers filed reports noting shell bursts consistently below target altitude. The phrase appeared repeatedly in internal communications. Too high. This realization forced a reckoning, and if the bombers could not be reached, they could not be stopped. Some commanders pushed for technological solutions, new interceptors, heavier armament, improved radar. Others emphasized sacrifice, urging pilots to ram bombers if necessary. These measures, born of desperation, reflected the narrowing range of options available. Meanwhile, American crews observed the change. Opposition was present, but increasingly ineffective. Fighters appeared sporadically. Anti-aircraft fire thinned. Missions became routine rather than exceptional. What had once been tense encounters evolved into calculated operations, executed with growing confidence. This asymmetry shaped decisions on both sides. For Japan, each raid deepened the sense that control of the air was slipping away. Cities could be reached at will. Industry could be disrupted without warning. Civil defense measures offered little protection from bombs falling from unseen heights. For the United States, altitude offered proof that strategic bombing could be sustained. Losses were acceptable. Results were measurable. And perhaps most importantly, the enemy's reactions revealed a system under strain. That strain would soon reach a breaking point. Because altitude alone, while devastating, was not the final answer. It was a phase, a demonstration of dominance that would soon give way to a far more destructive adaptation. And when that adaptation arrived, the balance of the air war would shift irreversibly. By early 1945, the pattern had become undeniable. B-29 formations continued to arrive over Japan with regularity. They appeared on radar earlier than expected, flew higher than anticipated, and departed with fewer losses than any previous bomber force Japan had faced. Each mission added data. Each interception attempt confirmed the same conclusion. The altitude gap was real and widening. Japanese commanders responded as doctrine demanded. Fighter units were repositioned closer to likely approach routes. Pilots were instructed to climb immediately upon alert, sacrificing formation discipline for altitude. Anti-aircraft units increased shell output, hoping volume might compensate for reach. Emergency conferences discussed new interception methods, including frontal attacks and ramming tactics. None solved the core problem. Climbing to 30,000 feet consumed fuel at unsustainable rates. Engines overheated. Pilots arrived at altitude fatigued, often hypoxic, struggling to maintain control. Even successful climbs left little time for attack before fuel exhaustion forced disengagement. The physics of the encounter favored the bomber. Japanese records from this period reveal mounting alarm. Reports from Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka describe bombers cruising calmly above defensive fire. Interceptor claims dropped sharply. Maintenance units reported increasing non-combat losses as aircraft failed under strain. Training commands warned that replacement pilots lacked the experience required for extreme altitude interception. At the strategic level, the implications were grim. High-altitude bombing limited Japan's ability to concentrate defenses. Bombers could select routes and targets with relative freedom. Even when damage was limited by weather or accuracy issues, the psychological effect remained constant. Japan could be struck at will from heights it could not contest. For American commanders, these outcomes forced reassessment, not of feasibility, but of effectiveness. High-altitude precision bombing faced challenges of its own. The jet stream, poorly understood at the time, scattered bomb patterns, weather-obscured targets. Bomb damage assessments showed mixed results. Industrial disruption occurred, but not at the scale planners had hoped. Yet the essential lesson remained intact. The bombers were surviving. The defenses were failing. This realization opened space for a decisive shift in strategy. If altitude could guarantee survival, then survivability could be traded for increased effectiveness. If interception was already difficult, lowering altitude would not necessarily invite catastrophic losses. Behind closed doors, American leadership debated adjustments. General Curtis LeMay, newly assigned to command the XXI Bomber Command, studied the data. He reviewed loss rates, weather reports, Japanese defenses, and industrial layouts. He noted the enemy's inability to respond effectively even when bombers descended lower. The conclusion forming was stark. Japan's air defenses were broken, not in spirit, but in capability. Altitude had revealed the weakness. The next step would exploit it. As B-29 crews prepared for new mission profiles, Japanese commanders remained focused on solving the altitude problem, unaware that the nature of the threat itself was about to change. And when it did, the results would be devastating. From unreachable heights to unstoppable pressure, the shift did not arrive with single announcement or dramatic order. IT emerged quietly through revised mission briefings and altered flight plans. In March 1945, American B-29 crews received new instructions. Altitude would no longer be the primary shield. Survivability had already been proven. Instead, the bombers would fly lower, faster, at night. This decision was not made lightly. It rested on months of evidence gathered from high-altitude operations. Japanese fighters had failed to intercept reliably. Anti-aircraft fire lacked precision. Radar coordination remained fragmented. The defenses had not adapted. For Japanese commanders, this adaptation by the enemy came too late to counter. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the nature of the air war changed permanently. Hundreds of B-29s approached Tokyo at lower altitudes than ever before. They flew beneath the jet stream, improving accuracy. Defensive fire struggled to track the fast-moving formations. Interceptors launched but arrived piecemeal, often too late. What followed was destruction on an unprecedented scale. Incendiary bombs ignited residential and industrial districts. Fire spread rapidly through wooden structures. Winds intensified the inferno. Firestorms formed. Japanese civil defense collapsed under the scale of the attack. For Japanese command centers, the reports were incomprehensible. Cities burned faster than damage assessments could be compiled. Communications failed. Units requested instructions that could not be given. The assumption that altitude was the enemy's main advantage no longer applied. Yet the roots of this catastrophe lay earlier. High-altitude bombing had demonstrated dominance. It had revealed that Japanese air defenses could not prevent sustained access to the home islands. That knowledge allowed American commanders to accept risks selectively, knowing losses would remain manageable. Japanese commanders now face a reality with no solution. High altitude had been unreachable. Low altitude was unstoppable. Fighter units lacked fuel. Pilots lacked training. Night interception capabilities were minimal. Radar coverage was insufficient to guide effective response. Each defensive weakness, exposed earlier by altitude, now compounded the devastation. Within weeks, Japanese leadership acknowledged the situation internally. The air war was lost. Factories could not be protected. Cities could not be defended. The homeland itself had become a battlefield, and there was no line to hold. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Commanders who once believed distance and altitude would shield Japan now confronted evidence that neither mattered. American bombers could choose how and when to strike. The initiative belonged entirely to the attacker. And as the fires died down, the implications extended beyond any single raid. Because what altitude had first revealed and adaptation had exploited was not just a tactical advantage. It was a collapse of Japan's capacity to resist from the air. That collapse would shape everything that followed. Damage measured in industry, strategy, and certainty. In the weeks that followed the intensified bombing campaign, Japanese command assessments shifted in tone. Early reports had focused on individual raids. Targets hit, aircraft lost, fires extinguished. Now the language widened. The concern was no longer a single city or factory, but the sustainability of a nation itself. Industrial damage mounted rapidly. Aircraft assembly plants struggled to maintain output as supply chain fractured. Power stations failed under repeated attacks. Transportation networks, rail yards, bridges, ports, became unreliable. Even factories left untouched by bombs suffered from shortages of materials, labor dislocation, and power interruptions. The bombing campaign did not need to destroy every facility. It only needed to disrupt enough nodes to paralyze the system. Japanese planners recognized this pattern. Reports circulated noting that American bombers were no longer targeting isolated military objectives alone. Urban industrial districts, where small workshops supported larger plants, had become priority targets. This approach proved devastating in an economy dependent on decentralized production. When neighborhoods burned, production burned with them. The psychological effects were equally severe. Civil defense measures collapsed under sustained pressure. Air raid shelters offered limited protection from fires. Evacuations disrupted labor forces. Rumors spread faster than official bulletins. The perception of helplessness, born earlier from altitude, now settled into daily life. From a military perspective, the air defense failure became undeniable. Interceptor sortie rates declined as fuel reserves dwindled. Maintenance units cannibalized aircraft to keep others flying. Pilot losses mounted faster than training pipelines could replace them. Attempts to concentrate defenses around major cities only exposed how thinly spread resources had become. Internally, Japanese leadership acknowledged the imbalance. Minutes from high-level conferences revealed growing acceptance that air superiority had passed irreversibly to the United States. Discussions shifted from interception to mitigation, how to preserve what remained rather than stop the attacks outright. The goal was no longer victory in the air, but survival under bombardment. American assessments, by contrast, reflected grim efficiency. Bomb damage surveys indicated rising effectiveness. Loss rates remained acceptable. Mission reliability improved. Crews adapted to new profiles with discipline and professionalism. The air campaign became systematic, planned, executed, evaluated, and repeated. Altitude had once been the headline. Now it was simply one factor among many in a mature bombing doctrine. For Japanese commanders, the realization carried a heavy conclusion. The technological gap exposed by high-altitude bombing had cascaded into operational collapse. No adjustment in tactics or courage could compensate for the absence of fuel, aircraft, radar, and trained pilots. And yet, even as this reality set in, the war did not end. The air campaign continued. The pressure intensified. What followed would not just reshape Japan's military capacity, but its strategic choices. Strategic consequences, an erosion of Japan's capacity. By mid-1945, the cumulative effects of sustained B-29 operations were unmistakable. Japanese air defenses, once confident and agile, had become reactive and ineffective. Commanders no longer debated whether attacks could be repelled. They debated how much damage each mission would cause, and how to conserve the resources that remained. The destruction extended beyond factories. Railways, ports, and communication lines were disrupted, slowing military logistics and hampering the transfer of troops and supplies. Cities faced shortages of food, fuel, and medical resources. Civilian morale began to fracture under repeated bombings and the constant threat of firestorms. Reports describe families fleeing urban centers, while authorities struggled to maintain order and essential services. The very infrastructure that had supported Japan's war effort was unraveling. Japanese military intelligence noted alarming patterns in American strategy. The XXI Bomber Command had learned from early high-altitude missions. Losses were now calculated, acceptable, and often mitigated by formation tactics and long-range planning. Night missions and low-altitude adjustments improved accuracy, while technological innovations, radar bombing, incendiary tactics, and coordinated strikes kept Japanese forces constantly reacting, never anticipating. Attempt to counter these developments proved insufficient. Fighter units, constrained by fuel and pilot shortages, could mount only sporadic interceptions. Anti-aircraft units, once a formidable deterrent, fired increasingly ineffectively at lower-flying targets. Even elite units found that every success was temporary, every adaptation met by further American innovation. The disparity in industrial capacity meant that losses, both material and human, could not be replaced at scale. Japanese command reports reflect the psychological toll. High-ranking officers documented frustration, disbelief, and growing despair. Observers described an invisible enemy problem, bombers that arrived from altitudes beyond reach, struck with precision, and returned to bases seemingly unharmed. Traditional strategies, decisive battles, concentrated defenses, tactical ingenuity, had failed to stop the Americans. Confidence in pre-war doctrines eroded, replaced by reactive measures and improvisation. The Americans, meanwhile, capitalized on this advantage. Bombing campaigns intensified, each mission building on the lessons of previous raids. Industrial and urban areas were struck systematically. Firestorms destroyed residential and production districts alike. Military logistics faltered. Civilian morale weakened, and Japan's ability to wage war from within its borders diminished rapidly. The campaign became as much a psychological and strategic instrument as a physical one. By the end of the spring of 1945, the picture was clear. Japan had lost control of its skies. Its cities were vulnerable. Its military-industrial complex was paralyzed, and its leadership faced the grim truth that the war could no longer be directed from the defensive posture they had once relied upon. High altitude had revealed the vulnerability. American adaptation had exploited it. The consequences, destruction, dislocation, and demoralization, would ripple to the very end of the conflict. This chain of events, rooted in technology, strategy, and command failure, set the stage for a final reflection on the role of air power, innovation, and human resilience in modern warfare. When altitude became history's measure, the story of the B-29 over Japan is more than a tale of aircraft or missions. It is a story of limits, human, technological, and doctrinal, and the relentless adaptation that defines warfare. High altitude revealed what Japan could not defend against: the convergence of engineering, industrial capacity, and strategic vision. It exposed a gap between expectation and reality, between belief and capability, that no single maneuver could bridge. For the men aboard the B-29, each mission tested endurance, skill, and nerve. Pressurized cabins shielded them from frostbite, while engines roared in thin air. Remote gun turrets required precision and focus. Navigators charted courses over thousands of miles. Their victories were not the result of heroics alone, but preparation, innovation, and coordinated effort. For Japanese commanders, the experience was humbling. The high-altitude threat forced a reckoning with the limitations of existing aircraft, training, and industrial output. It demonstrated that courage and tenacity alone cannot overcome structural disadvantages. Repeatedly, they faced the same conclusion: an enemy who mastered the sky could strike at will, leaving only reaction and adaptation in its wake. In a broader sense, these raids marked a transformation in modern warfare. Air power no longer depended solely on proximity or numbers. Altitude, technology, and logistics could redefine the battlefield entirely. Cities, once protected by distance and expectation, became exposed. Strategies that had guided generations of planners were challenged, reshaped, and ultimately rendered insufficient. The B-29 campaign over Japan stands as a testament to the intersection of human ingenuity and strategic foresight. It reminds us that in war, the unseen, whether altitude, innovation, or industrial capacity, can determine outcomes as surely as bullets or bombs. And it leaves history with a quiet, immutable lesson. Mastery of the sky can change the course of nations,